This summer, I decided to take a course on Introduction to African History, simply because I had never taken it before, but also because it had never been offered before. Everything I've learned has far surpassed anything I could have imagined. And although this video is not 6 weeks long, I wanted to share with you everything I've learned, everything I've taken away, how I'm challenging current stereotypes held about Africa, and how I am appreciating all of the African culture surrounding me. Often, to appreciate all of the legacies and effects of the transatlantic slave system, I try to imagine an alternate timeline, a slavery-free timeline. What does it look like? Who would be here now? Can you even begin to imagine it? Probably not. The legacies and effects of the transatlantic slave system were endless, but that wasn't only just due to the work done by African slaves. The legacies reach far beyond and far before that. To fully understand the influence of Africa on our modern world, we must consult primary sources from those who arrived here in the 17th century. They are the only ones who can tell the story and exactly how it happened. However, to understand everything that was exchanged during the transatlantic slave system, we must go back across the Atlantic. While the Swahili people were transforming the Indian Ocean into a multicultural, Mediterranean-like exchange of commerce, the people on the west coast of Africa were the Mande people, inhabiting that area well into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. You may have heard of the great accomplishments of the Mande people, and maybe even of their alleged divine leader, Sunjata. The temperate climate in West Africa was ideal for agricultural practices. With Columbus arriving in the New World, foreign diseases ravaging populations of Native Americans, and the desire for more physical labor and conversions to Christianity, Europeans began bringing Africans to the Americas. However, this was not a one-way street, as it is so often taught. The transatlantic slave system, a phrase coined by Kwasi Konadu to replace the Atlantic slave trade, shows that it was an exchange between Europeans and Africans. Africans were sought for their extensive agricultural knowledge and their physical build that lent itself to temperate climate agriculture. The world history narrative that Africa used to be good and fell behind due to a lack of complexity and natural resources is not applicable here at all. In fact, the complete opposite is true. Africans had complex political systems and extensive knowledge about agriculture, blacksmithing, and commerce. They were not, as Binyavanga Wainaina satirically explained, too busy starving and dying and warring and emigrating. In a newly colonized world, Africans and their skills and knowledge were highly sought after. Africans were captured as prisoners of religious wars, and they were also traded by African sellers in exchange for European textiles. However, regardless of the means, the unfortunate reality remains that Africans were captured and transported across the Atlantic and forced to work in unfavorable, sometimes outright inhumane conditions. What's often dwelled on about this exchange are the horrible working conditions, the political racism, the white supremacy, and the downright disregard for humanity. While terrible and rightfully condemned, there still does remain a lot to learn from African history as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. However, and this is the important part, we must learn this through the African lens and not the European lens. But that lens differs greatly from area to area. The influences from Africa in the Caribbean islands differ greatly from those in Brazil, which also differ from those of other South American countries, which is also very different from the influences found in southeastern United States. Thus, in order to understand the rich history and culture that also made the trip across the Atlantic, an in-depth analysis is required. I've lived near Charleston my whole life, taken many field trips to plantations, and walked along the docks and streets of downtown Charleston more times than I can count. However, I'd only been taking Charleston for what it was on its surface, not the deep history underneath. Much of what Charleston is today is due to African slave labor that came across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage transportation between Africa and the Americas was cruel and gruesome, often identified by bodily excretions, gastrointestinal diseases, and anger-turned rebellion against Africans' captors. Some of them went mad on the journey, others went mad by the shackles binding their extremities together, and others' minds remained intact, although barely. Nearly every slave experienced this passage, and, upon arrival at their destination, they were often sold at a slave market such as this, and were then dispersed to begin labor. For example, Omar ibn Said, a 37-year-old from West Africa, was transported across the Atlantic to Charleston, after having received 25 years of education in West Africa. Upon arrival in Charleston, he was very difficult with his masters and rebelled often, refusing to diminish his schooling to physical field labor. Identified as one of the more difficult slaves to deal with, Said was a master's headache and was often sold from owner to owner. However, many of the African slaves that arrived in Charleston did not rebel nearly as openly and began their labor in the rice fields. Many of those slaves would have worked on a rice plantation, such as this one, the Rice Hope Plantation. The water behind me is a former rice field, over 300 acres large, each divided into 2-acre plots. This field was operated on a task system. Each slave would perform an individual task on the field, and then afterwards would be able to basket weave or work on their own provisional plots. You can also see behind me, over here, an old community mill, where rice was brought from plantations all around. Just look at the vastness of this field. Can you imagine the yield that slave labor would have provided for their masters? Here you can see an enhanced reproduction of what rice production on this plantation would have looked like in 1795. However, the cultivation of rice was not the only knowledge they brought with them. Today, in Charleston, many examples of African culture and knowledge are evident, and some, in fact, are the main tourist attractions that bring people to Charleston. Sweetgrass baskets are almost identical in style to the choucoublé baskets found in Sierra Leone, where it is an important rite of passage to learn how to coil baskets so tightly they can hold water. Similar structures were first created as rice fanners, but as materials were exchanged and changed, sweetgrass baskets began to be made. As you can see here, sweetgrass baskets can take a variety of shapes and sizes when they're created. Even today, many skilled basket weavers set up their shops in this Charleston City Market to sell their baskets, and along Highway 17 in Mount Pleasant, known as the Sweetgrass Basket Highway. They are instrumental in preserving the skilled traditions of their ancestors. If you ever come to visit the Charleston City Market, you will see that many of these tables are covered in intricately designed sweetgrass baskets. Iron, which has been a symbol of power and masculinity in Africa for centuries, allowed another skill to board the ships that transported slaves across the Atlantic: blacksmithing. Beautiful wrought iron gates have become a staple of Charlestonian streets, but the blacksmithing techniques used to make them did not appear out of thin air. They were utilized and perfected in West Africa, and are another overlooked detail in the connection fostered by the Atlantic slave trade. For example, Philip Simmons, who passed away in 2009, is credited with many of the iron gates located around Charleston, including this one, the Double Heart Gate, located at Philip Simmons Gardens on Anson Street. Many of his works are located in art galleries and museums all around the nation. Additionally, a little closer to my backyard, is the old Santee Canal, as you can see behind me. Originally intended as a trade shortcut between Columbia and Charleston, this canal is now an integral part of the South Carolina Low Country's waterways. It was 22 miles long and 35 feet wide, all dug by African slaves whose owners rented them out to the Santee Canal Company. No dynamite was used, relying instead on the physical strength of Africans and their efficient use of pickaxes, wheelbarrows, and shovels. The entire project was completed in only 7 short years. Lastly, and probably one of the most important influences, are the Gullah Geechee people. These people were the ones enslaved on the coastal regions of South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. As mentioned earlier, the Gullah Geechee people are very well known for their intricately designed sweetgrass baskets. But equally important was their nearly perfected art of storytelling and their exquisite cooking skills. As many oral epics, such as Sanjata and the Rise of the Mali Empire, were told orally by Jeliu throughout Africa, the tradition of storytelling also crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade. Many modern storytellers in competition, such as the Moth, could only dream of having the intricate detail and seamlessly woven themes of the Gullah stories in their own. Gullah aspects of cuisine can be seen on the menus of many restaurants in Charleston, including this one, Virginia's on King, and it's one of my personal favorites. Although life was cruel and unfair for many slaves living in the Americas, it is important to not overlook the cultural tidbits that also came with them across the Atlantic. However, due to African resiliency and strength, many of those people and their ideas were able to return to Africa. The people enslaved in South Carolina soon returned to the west coast of Africa and attempted to found Sierra Leone in 1787. Originally failing, British forces came in under the Sierra Leone Company and created an entirely new place with an entirely new culture. The influence of American, African, and Nova Scotian cultures blended together to create the Creole, or as we know today, Creole culture. The Creole people became highly educated and began combating the racist policies that were in existence to humiliate them under the European lens. As you can see, the effects of the Atlantic slave trade reached far and wide, and today I've only touched the surface of a deep historical connection to Africa that resides in Charleston. You may then ask, why dive into it? Why ask questions? Why does it matter? It matters because the majority of the Atlantic slave trade has been taught through a European lens, one that belittles Africa, one that only identifies it with slavery, one that identifies its inhabitants as subhuman, and one that declares its desperate need for foreign aid to get on its feet. As we've seen today from just a few tiny examples, the complete opposite is true. Africans are complex, intelligent, crafty, powerful, and forward-thinking people. The Atlantic slave trade was detrimental to the African psyche and was influential in tarnishing the name of Africa, a phrase coined by Chinua Achebe. However, it offered the Europeans involved a glimpse into the sophistication of Africa, whether they wanted to believe it or not. As primary sources become more available and information is transmitted more easily, it becomes our duty to illuminate the ways that European stereotypes about Africa were mistaken, and to ensure that those stereotypes do not affect our current biases and perspectives. Chinua Achebe described it best when he warned against the name of Africa remaining tarnished. When we are comfortable and inattentive, we run the risk of committing grave injustices absent-mindedly.
Look ya, down here in these sea island and thing, plenty of work you think for do. Crit.